we'll probably go to you about the Washington Stealth moving to Vancouver. What do you think?
I would say I was surprised. There was not any sort of rumbling I heard from any of the players or staff that I know. Uh, Business-wise, I can see why they did the move. They, especially now I've seen how they implemented it. The Langley Event Center staff is now running a bunch of the people that they had otherwise had hired in Everett. So now their overhead is reduced probably dramatically with not having individual employees, and so now have shared resources. So as a business move, it's sound. As a fan move, it's difficult. I think they'll have 3,000 less seats at least, maybe 4,000 less seats than they have even in Everett. So it's tough to lose that many potential seats, but if they weren't filling anyways, they probably don't have too much concern for that. They got a better deal to keep the thing going, which is better than shutting down. So I'm happy I'll still be able to watch games. I know I won't be going to nearly as many. The concern I have was it's the drive home. It's easy to kind of get amped up and drive 6 hours to a game because you get to watch a game afterwards. But the next day, you don't get to have a game when you get home. You just have a 6-hour drive to get home and then think about work the next day after that. So that's the reason we didn't renew our season tickets right away. We'll go hit a few games up for sure, but not every game anymore.
That's a long drive to be making for every single game.
Yeah.
Sounds like it was a long enough drive before. You were already driving 3 or 4 hours to and from the games, right?
Yeah, it's about 3.5 on average up to every game from my house to Everett. It didn't really bother us, but 6, we found our threshold.
As much as I love the Mammoth, I don't think I could do a 6-hour drive. I don't know if I could do a 3-hour drive. We have some people drive up from Colorado Springs, and I don't think I could do that. It's great, but that's a long day.
Yes, it is.
I'm kind of lucky in that I drive an hour to a Rock game. I can drive an hour to a Bandits game, and I can drive about 3.5 to a Nighthawks game. But I haven't been to a Nighthawks game in probably 5 years. And then I start talking to people like yourself, Tyler, and there's one guy I was talking to in Minnesota who drives 4, 5, 6 hours, I can't remember which, per game as well. And I started thinking Rochester's really not that far. I could make it there and back in a night. Unless I'm bringing my kids or something, I probably wouldn't even bother with a hotel and just drive back and maybe get back at 2 or 3 in the morning, but I can do that. But I don't. Seems kind of odd.
You gotta want to do it. But Everett was great as there was a bar in the arena that everybody went to afterwards. We got to see all the people the fans were used to, all the players. It was a great atmosphere that didn't really want to push us away. Like, you can just go hang out after every game and see people, and it made you want to stay as opposed to just wait for the final whistle and run out of there.
I wonder if that's sort of an odd kind of advantage to having lower attendance, in that if I'm going to go to the Toronto Rock after game party, there's going to be hundreds of people there, considering they have attendance of 10 or 12,000 per game. In Colorado, I imagine it's even worse than that because you've got 15, 16,000 per game.
When they're on a winning streak, the Blue Sky Grill gets very packed. When they're on a losing streak, it's actually pretty mellow. So the past few seasons, yeah, you've been able to go in right after the game, find a booth, and it's not that bad. But when they were on a winning streak, you had to have somebody from your group go down early to secure a table because they were just gone and everyone was hovering around and it was packed.
So it sounds like Vancouver will have likely the lowest attendance in the league again next year, even if they pack the arena every night. So from a numbers point of view, it looks like it may not be an awful lot better. But if they do pack the place, that's 5,500 people per game, which is more than the Stealth were getting. But if the team is spending less money, then overall it ends up being a plus. In that you're not going to see the team vanish, and that's certainly a good thing for the league.
Yeah.
I'd have to wonder though, would they be spending less money simply with the airfare? I mean, crossing the border is pretty expensive. So if they're mostly flying to Minnesota and Denver and playing, well, I guess with Calgary it'd be easier, but with half the teams, you'd think that would actually have just raised the cost somewhat.
Most of the guys flew out of Vancouver anyways. They're like one or two places one or two places they would drive down to Seattle to then fly to wherever the opponent was. But they were already flying out of Vancouver for, I think, 3/4 of the guys anyways. So it's not that bad.
So yeah,
not really a change.
That might have been a savings for them then.
Yeah.
Okay, so we think the move to Vancouver is certainly not going to be convenient for a lot of Everett fans. So I guess the ones that live very close, it's probably not too bad in that it's an hour and a half drive up to Vancouver, plus a border crossing, which is certainly some inconvenience. So that may not be a bad thing for a lot of the fans in that area anyway. And there's certainly, in theory, a lot of NLL fans in the lower mainland of BC. So they're going to get a lot of local Vancouver people out to those games. If the championship game last year was any indication, they packed that place. Now that, of course, is the championship, and it's a novelty. They don't get NLL games there that often. Now that they have their own team, who knows how that'll work. But if I remember correctly, the Ravens got pretty decent attendance when they were there. Now, this was most of 10 years ago now. And low attendance wasn't the problem, wasn't why they left Vancouver. So hopefully, even if they get similar attendance to what the Ravens did, they'll be able to do better.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, the issue with Vancouver was they weren't getting any of the concessions and parking and things like that. So that's what, and the rent was high to boot, so they just weren't getting that income.
I would imagine the rent at the Langley Event Center is going to be way cheaper than I think it was GM Place that the Ravens played. So that will certainly help. And if they've had any kind of deal to get parking revenue or concession revenue or whatever, then that'll help as well. So why don't we move to the next story, which is something that surprised the heck out of me, and I didn't see anybody who saw this one coming, was Troy Cordingley being fired as coach of the Toronto Rock. Just, maybe a month, at most 2 months, after being named Coach of the Year. I didn't see it coming. I don't remember seeing anybody who did see it coming. I kind of don't buy the we're moving in a different direction thing. I mean, if you've got the Coach of the Year, you had the best regular season record. Yeah, they blew it in the playoffs. But if you're going to fire your coach after 4 years and a Coach of the Year and a better than decent record for those 4 years, made the playoffs every year, you're going to fire him because they crapped the bed in one game, that seems pretty harsh. So I'm guessing there's some other thing involved in that whole thing that we may never find out what it was.
I was definitely surprised. Like you just said, I mean, you have a cup, you have good seasons, good records, good attendance still. I mean, we've seen coaches that are still coaching or just recently got fired that had way worse seasons repeatedly. I mean, heck, look how much we've changed in Denver. And sometimes they'll wait until 2-3 seasons before they'll cut it, and we don't have anything to show for it. Accordingly, at least has something to show for it. He has a cup.
Yeah, this surprised me more than the stealth move. The stealth move wasn't like wild. This was a proven coach who can probably one of the top 2-3 coaches in the league. And you let him go. and you replace him with somebody who's assistant who's probably going to be in the same form and style that Cordingley ran in, how different is it going to be?
It may end up being more different now in that John Lovell's a different kind of guy than Cordingley. You know, it's not like I know these guys personally, so I can't speak to what the differences might be. But they've also revamped half their coaching staff as well. Blaine Manning, who's now retired, will be the offensive coach. And I'm blanking on who the defensive... Oh, Dan Lattiser. So former Rock defender Dan Lattiser is going to be the defensive coach, taking over for Terry Sanderson. So these guys, I believe, have some coaching experience in whether it's junior or senior, I'm not sure. It's certainly not at the NLL level. And I think Lattiser was coaching in CLAX last year as well. So they have some coaching experience. At some point, every coach has to have a rookie season. Whether it's a good idea to have two of them at one time, well, I guess we'll have to see. But Cordingley is now, to no one's surprise, a Buffalo Bandit after Darius Kilgore was relieved of his duties. There is some talk that Kilgore and Cordingley are kind of similar coaches, so is this really that big of a change for the Bandits? Who knows, but Darius Kilgore doesn't seem too happy about it.
No, he had a very frustrated response in his interview after being let go, and then I don't think anybody's heard from him since then. Just kind of like, I'm done, I'm stepping away.
Unfortunately, I think that was a decision the Bandits should have made probably 3 years ago, maybe 4. It's one of those things. The team has definitely been on a slide, and it just kept getting worse and worse. And I'm sorry, some of his public comments, I just don't see how that could have fired up the team. I think that hurt morale, and so you just kept seeing it just dropping and dropping and dropping until finally got to a point. It's like, how can you really not do anything?
You got to wonder if he was trying to fire up the team by saying these things, and maybe to a certain extent it could have worked. I can see, I mean, I've seen it in other sports where a coach will call out a particular player and say, this guy didn't play very well in that game, and sometimes that ends up firing up the player and have him try to prove himself all over again. Whether that would work with an entire team, I'm not sure I agree with that. And as you said, Melissa, it wasn't just once, it was several times that he called out several players by name. He called out his entire team. He said they had no heart. He said they were playing stupid. That doesn't sound like he's trying to get them fired up. It just sounds like he's frustrated, which is understandable, but he's not controlling his emotions very well, and that can't be a good thing for his team.
Well, yeah, and I mean, if you're doing that in the locker room, maybe that's one thing. You know, maybe you are firing him up, but it seemed like he was getting more and more negative, and it was getting really vicious when you read his interviews. It's like, holy cow, how can anyone want to play for him when you're getting that vitriol just week in and week out? I can't imagine. You know, it's not just a, hey, you did really bad this game, you need to step it up. It was just just vomiting on them all this negativity. I just don't think that helped. I think it definitely exacerbated their lack of drive to me. You know, not only was he doing this, he was doing it completely publicly, just trying to humiliate them, and I think that was the wrong way to go.
I agree. That's for adults. These guys are kind of like grown men who frequently coach themselves, and they understand styles that are needed. I think Kilgore just did things his way only, and didn't adjust to what they needed at any point.
Well, he's certainly a good enough coach that it would kind of surprise me to not see him back in the NLL at some point. But it also wouldn't surprise me much if we don't see or hear anything from him for the next season. Maybe the season after that he might show up as an assistant coach somewhere, or maybe even a head coach again. But he may just take 2014 off entirely.
Yeah, he strikes me as the type that wouldn't be willing to go back to second fiddle.
Good point.
And if you're a general manager and you're looking at what he did with the media, I'd be second guessing him no matter how good of a coach he was. I mean, do you want that in your own media?
Unless you figure he'll be good for the first few years, and if it gets to the point where we start really sucking and he's getting frustrated, you get rid of him right away. You don't let it linger for the 3 or 4 or 5 or however many years the Bandits did.
Yeah.
That arguably, like you said, they should have done this a couple of years ago. I remember wondering at one point, I think it was before last season or possibly the one before, when Kilgore was both coach and GM, and he essentially fired himself as GM and remained as coach. And I remember wondering at the time if he should have done it the other way around.
Yeah, I remember a lot of discussion about that. A lot of people thought it should have been the other way.
Okay, so that's Troy's story. Sticking with Buffalo, probably the biggest trade in the offseason. Well, there hasn't been an awful lot. But I imagine once we have a new CBA, then all the GMs will go crazy. But until then, we have Ryan Benesch and Andrew Watt going from Minnesota to Buffalo for a couple of first-round picks. I didn't see this one coming either. I'm surprised that Minnesota let Benesch go.
Yeah.
I don't think he's even 30 yet.
Yeah, I think 27. He definitely had not hit his expiration date according to the previous Minnesota standards of like usually around 30. And so he was a little young for them to dump like this, but I think he also had the stats to demand a high price salary, and that's completely against the Minnesota way as it's come to be the last few years.
It does seem odd that they would trade away somebody who is pretty much in his prime. I mean, he could certainly even get better. Like you said, if he's 27, 28, he could certainly have a couple years at or near the top scoring in the league. And it seems odd to trade him for a couple of first-round picks, considering their best possible outcome from the first-round picks is you get somebody like Ryan Benesch. Well, you've already got him, so as you said, Tyler, it could certainly be a salary thing that they want players as good as Benesch, but they can't afford to pay him what he's making or what he demands or what he deserves. So they would have to get rid of him and hope that they get somebody out of these first-round picks that ends up being roughly the same but much cheaper for a few years until he gets to be 27. They trade him.
It's a pretty radical difference. The star players are going to make around $30,000, and if they're been around long enough to get the franchise tag, I think it's like $34,000, $35,000, and a rookie makes 10. You can get 3 rookies for the price of 1 player. That's a significant difference as soon as you get a few years in the league performing well.
Yeah, this one definitely caught me off guard. I think, like you were saying, Tyler, I think it really came down to just the money. Because it really doesn't make sense. He's a fan favorite. He's putting up the numbers routinely. I mean, why else would you trade him?
He lives in Minnesota, I believe, so it's not like he's demanding to be closer to home. Now, he is closer to home. He grew up in Kitchener. But as far as I know, he was living in Minnesota.
Yeah, I think he was one of the players because they had 7 or 8 of them living out there.
Yep.
He's been coaching their junior indoor team this summer, and it kind of reminds me of the Jamie Shuchuk trade a few years ago, where he lives in Denver and he got traded to Minnesota, and then so all of a sudden he's like, "But I live here, guys." And I'm like, "Well, you don't play here anymore." And they ended up bringing him back a little bit later, but it was for the guys who've really committed to a team and move in market and get traded away. It's a pretty awkward feeling.
Yeah, a lot of fans would like to see Shuey back in the Mammoth uniform, though. So maybe this season, because I know he's not giving up on it. He's still working hard trying to get back into it.
from the Buffalo point of view, they certainly, obviously they're getting Benesch, one of the best scorers in the league, and that's certainly going to help them. But they've given up their next 2 first-round picks for Cosmo, and now they've given up the next 2 after that, so they won't have another first-round pick for the next 4 years. So Mr. Dietrich better be pretty confident in the players he's got or his ability to make trades, because the draft is, I guess you can get decent players in the second and third rounds, or maybe make future trades to get first-round picks back. But if you're looking to draft the likes of Mark Matthews and Logan Schuss and stuff, you're not going to have that for a bunch of years.
Yeah, not at all. You definitely need Benesch to perform at prime level for the 4 years until you get a pick back for that. It's a long time.
Yeah, and that's a huge risk. I mean, we've seen some really great players do well in college or in a different league, and then they come into the NLL and they just can't cut it. So they may have been great elsewhere, but they may not hold up to that level. So I would say for Buffalo, it was probably a great trade that's actually going to boost their team. I don't know that Minnesota really improved their situation, except maybe getting a little more money to go around.
They certainly likes to stockpile their first-round draft picks, so they have all of theirs and all of Buffalo's for the next 4 years. And I think they got another one somewhere else from Philadelphia, I think. So I counted them up a little while ago when I tweeted what they had, and I think Buffalo had 0 first-round picks in the next 4 years, and Minnesota has 11 or something.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Makes you wonder if they actually are trying to make an all-rookie team, or if they have some other trades in mind. They're going to be trading those away.
well, if their rookies work out as well for the next couple of years as they have in the previous couple, they could be a pretty decent team.
Yeah, and the concern frequently voiced in other leagues is you can't have a young team because they don't have the experience. But in the NLL, one team doesn't make the playoffs, so everybody gets playoff experience. So you have first and second year players on the Swarm now that have, I think, second year players have 4 games of playoff experience already in the NLL. So they're getting that experience. It's a big hump to get over to get to the finals and win a championship. But to have played 4 playoff games after just 2 years in the NLL, that alleviates a lot of the concern with having a really young team.
Well, and look at Minnesota last year. I mean, I think overall they did have the youngest team, and if they wouldn't have just stumbled at the end, they could have done it. I mean, Mammoth have had several veteran teams, and we can't seem to make it past the first round most of the time. So maybe they are doing it the right way.
So what was the next? The next topic I had listed was Pat OToole being elected to the Hall of Fame. Kind of odd that it's the 3rd straight year that it was only one player being elected, and it was the 3rd straight year that it was a goalie. And there was some discussion on the Isle Indoor message boards the last couple of days, saying that there's only about 20 people in the NLL Hall of Fame. It's only been around for about 5 years. But almost half of them are goalies, or some insane ratio. You would figure it'd be roughly 1 to 5 or thereabouts, because there's far more defenders and transition players and forwards than there are goalies. But there's a lot of goalies in there. So here's a 3rd straight. Not saying that OToole isn't deserving, he certainly is. It just seemed odd that OToole would get elected and Caleb Toth and Pat McCready were not. And it was not like they were close either. They were off by 30 percentage points, I think, to get in.
I wonder if the goalies split the vote less. Like, they're more neutral, so people aren't quite as political about them, maybe, because if it's a defender that they played against, maybe they'll vote against them because they didn't like them, not because they were a good player and deserved to be in. They're just like, no, you used to hit me all the time. I'm not voting for you. Maybe with the goalie, since you just don't have as much of that, they're not as polarizing.
Yeah, along those lines, it's a lot easier for the one goalie on the team to stick out compared to the 5, but really about 10 runners. You got 5 D guys on the first string, 5 O guys on the first string, so 10 guys there plus all the other subs, and then one goalie. You really remember who was out there when their teams are winning titles and stuff.
And it could be that these are 3 of the best goalies who've ever played. I mean, Ilias went in a few years ago. Then the last 3 have been Watson and Dietrich, and now OToole. So it could be that we now have the best of the best in terms of goaltenders in the Hall of Fame, and then after that, who's next, and are the next set of goaltenders anywhere near at the same plateau, or are they kind of further down? So for the next, maybe there won't be any more goaltenders for the next 5 years, and it'll be all runners.
Yeah, the inactive goalie list, who's not in the Hall of Fame, drops off considerably now that OToole has made it.
Yeah,
So
when you look at who was nominated, I mean, they weren't as stand out, I think, across the board. I mean, kind of like Tyler said, maybe they just didn't stand out enough. I mean, if Tavares is up, he's going to get voted in because he is one of the best. But a lot of these guys, they split just loyalties a lot, from what teams they played with, who they played against, who they played with, and maybe that's just more long term.
I was surprised that Caleb Toth didn't make it in, and I know there was some talk on Twitter and such that other people were surprised that he didn't get in. Was he and this is something that I wrote in my blog this morning about the whole idea of a first ballot Hall of Famer versus just a regular Hall of Famer, I suppose. And like you said, people like Tavares, Gary Gait, John Grant will be there, Colin Doyle will be there. Those sort of people will be in the Hall of Fame, and that's pretty much a given. Is Caleb Toth in that echelon? Probably not. But given the numbers that he's put up, he was the face of the Roughnecks for the better part of a decade. I think he deserves to be there. And if you look at other players in the Hall of Fame, and like I said, there aren't that many. But if you look at somebody like Dan Stroop, was he a great player? Sure he was. Was he a Hall of Famer? I'd probably argue that he wasn't. But seeing as he is, and Toth's numbers are better than his, it would make sense to me that Toth should be in there.
Yeah, I would agree. I was definitely surprised he didn't get voted in.
Yeah, it's a question of how elite do you really make it. Right now, there's great players who are in our history. We saw Toth do the great goal in 2001 and win titles later. I think 09 and 11. Probably so he got like 3 titles. It's really great stuff. But as time progresses, and if the League sticks around, you got to look at the Hall of Fame as a percentage of players. Like look at the Baseball Hall of Fame. There's historically thousands and thousands of players, and there's a couple hundred guys in there. It's very small percentage. So if you want to keep that kind of ratio and concept of elite players in the Hall of Fame, not just guys that were good last decade. I mean, 3 titles, face of a team is incredible, but is it really, really elite? And to keep the Hall of Fame at the point where it's not just the best player from every team necessarily, it's the guys that were the best. It's a hard line to try to figure out.
I heard it once described as if you can't describe the league for a certain period of time without mentioning that guy's name, then he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. So I mean, obviously the Tavareses and the Grants and the Dietrichs and the Watsons and those kind of guys are certainly up there. Can you talk about the NLL in the 2000s, I guess, without mentioning Caleb Toth?
I think not.
You probably,
the 2001 goal.
It was that one goal
starting,
for sure.
Yeah, starting Calgary and building Calgary around him. If you talk about Calgary, you mentioned him before. You mentioned like Ratcliffe and Sanderson. Short time there, Toth comes up first. So, in those terms, I can see Toth as a Hall of Famer.
There's a lot of people in Canada who are talk about Paul Henderson and whether he deserves to be in the Hockey Hall of Fame. And I don't know how familiar you are with the whole Summit series from 1972, but that was one of the first series between Canada and Russia. I think it was just the two teams, and Canada ended up winning that. And Paul Henderson scored the winning goal, and it's one of the most famous goals in Canadian history. So a lot of people are saying because he scored that goal, he needs to be in the Hall of Fame. But he had kind of a decent NHL career. So it was almost like, other than that goal, he isn't anywhere close to worthy to the Hall of Fame. But that goal makes him that way. I don't think Toth is the same way there, in that he had a very good NLL career. It wasn't like he was just a decent player who happened to score a really big goal. He was a very good player who happened to score a very big goal. So you could argue that with the career and the goal, he really should be there.
I think we exhausted that topic.
Looks like it, yeah. Those were all the topics that I had listed here. The one other that I can remember wondering about, and Tyler, maybe you have some thoughts on this, was Washington. Vancouver stealth player Tim Henderson, who's only played one season, has been sent off to Afghanistan. He was in the Army, U.S. Army, and I think he played lacrosse for the Army, and then he was drafted by the Stealth, played one season, and now he's off to Afghanistan. So he will not be in the league this year. I don't know how long that will be. Maybe you guys know more about that than I do, being a Canadian. But it looks like the Stealth will be without Henderson this year.
Yeah, I read it was a 9-month deployment, and there's obviously no way that ends before the season ends. He was stationed out of, which means living in Oklahoma last season. So he flew in from Oklahoma for every game. He has a great big body and really kind of a project, even though they don't do a lot of projects in the NLL these days with the contraction. But he came in as just an incredible athlete and grew as a player during the game and during the season, and got better pretty much every game. There was a risk that this was obviously going to happen at any point with him being in the Army, and I think the Stealth got him with around a 5th or 6th round draft pick. It was maybe sooner, but I remember it being a later pick. So it was kind of a low cost, high reward in that they got a season out of him, and it's a bummer because we can't see him continued growth coming back for the second season. I watched players like Kyle Hartzell and Chris O'Doherty recently go through a year of learning the system, and then their second year is really expanding their skill sets to be a much better player when they as American field converts with the Stealth. And even like 5 years before that, you watch Eric Martin come in and do the same thing to grow as players. So I think the Stealth, with their defensive coach Art Webster, have a proven history of converting American field players, but it takes the consistency of being there every year. So it's sad we're going to lose that. I think he had potential to be a player like that because he's just got the size and athletic ability to do it, but he needs to be here to do that. He's got a much bigger commitment. It's how he got through college and by being in the Army, and this is now the job he has to do. And when he returns, he can have a chance to play. There's been MLL players a lot of guys who went through the Naval Academy, and then when the MLL was in California for a few years, those guys would go out to San Diego and serve, and they were able to either come back and play after a few years of time away. So I'm not sure he can do that in the NLL in the same way. Depends on how long he has to be gone, if he gets redeployed by the time next season comes around. But it was nice seeing him play, and if he can come back in a reasonable amount of time, he can have a chance to continue, but he just may not.
Okay, well, I think that's all the topics that I had scheduled for today.
Emails If you wanted, we had Rory Smith traded to Buffalo for Carter Bender, and Wings hire
right.
Blaine Harrison as head coach. If we want to discuss either of those, they were on your original list.
That's right. I do remember having a longer list. I don't know anything about Blaine Harrison. I know Johnny Meridian was the Wings coach last year, and I guess he took himself out of that position and kept the GM job. But it looks as if I think Harrison was an assistant for them last year, and it looks as if they had been sort of grooming him to take over as head coach. So this was an expected move from their point of view. But I don't know anything about him. I don't know if you guys do.
I don't.
He was not memorable as the assistant. He's also an assistant with the Titans. I don't know if we're in New York, but definitely we're in Orlando. So he's been around the game for quite a while. My experience with Johnny Meridian in the same position, there was a year or two where he was the coach GM in San Jose when I was down there. Then he stepped away and let the guy, had Walt Christensen come in and coach, and kind of let Coach Walt do his thing. Then after Christensen, put Jeff Dowling in, and Meridian was completely injected himself in that situation. He was doing kind of like the hockey thing where he had a guy in the headset, like giving him notes during the game and not stepping away. So we'll see if this is a situation where Blaine Harrison can be the coach and do things his way, or it's borderline just being a puppet for Meridian, and you got to listen to him and do all these things. And when the Stealth did that, it lasted about 7 games before Dowling was out, and that's when they brought in Chris Hall. Thankfully, we were very lucky to get that. So I've seen Meridian step away and let a guy coach, but he followed it up with a guy who one of his guys who he put in there to do his coaching for him. And I don't know which way it's going to go with Harrison until we, I think, get into game time.
Well, it's definitely more than
Harrison's
I think either of us know. Go ahead, Graeme.
I was going to say, if Harrison's going to just do the bidding of Johnny Meridian, well, the Wings sort of had an up and down season last year. I'd imagine they're hoping for better this year, so maybe a change of I'm going to say change of ownership, but that's not right. Change of coaching might not be a bad thing for them.
Yeah.
And Melissa, I imagine you have some thoughts about Rory Smith.
Yeah, a little bit. That one was definitely a surprise, I think, for most Mammoth fans. Like, I wouldn't deny that our defense needs some shakeup. It has gone downhill the past couple years. Honestly, it was surprising when we lost Catton. Since he was getting older, you kind of would have thought that things would have started improving, but apparently he had more of an impact than most of us realized, because I would put most of our downhill slide to that. I kind of had a love-hate watching Rory play. He definitely had an impact. He was a very hard-nosed player, but there were some penalties maybe he didn't need to take, that he maybe was a little more aggressive than he needed to be. Although I would say he's at least smarter about it than Chet K was. Konechny definitely did some things that it was just like, oh my God, what the hell are you doing? But it was a surprise. I don't know anything about Carter Bender, so I'm, and it seems like everyone I've talked to has kind of been like, Carter who? So I'll say I'm a little disappointed. I don't know that we really got a worthwhile trade, but maybe there was mitigating issues that we just don't know about.
I saw this as a trade for Buffalo to actually address an issue. If you look at the Benesch and Watt trade, I think they were just kind of almost preying upon Minnesota's need to dump older players. And both Andrew Watt and Benesch are from Kitchener, which is where Dietrich's from, so he's getting his guys in. But with Rory Smith, it's a chance to pick up a defender who can be very solid. He's played on the Canadian national team in the past, and so he's proved himself to be an above-average defender. And if you look at Buffalo last year, they were terrible, and they were terrible on defense and offense. So they needed new defenders, and this is a pretty good defender to pick up to try to correct some of those issues.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think Denver's defense just got worse. And we're not going to have Johnny Gallant too many more seasons. I wouldn't be surprised if he decides before the season starts to retire or afterwards. He took a lot of hard hits last year that really could have knocked him out. And he's definitely getting up there. I mean, he's mid-30s, 35, 34, somewhere in there. And with 2 kids, I can't imagine after some of the concussions and hits he took last year that hasn't at least crossed his mind. And to lose a leader like that off the team is definitely going to have a huge impact. I don't know that any of our current defenders are going to step up. They just didn't have a cohesion last year. They didn't have a drive last year that they really needed. And I think losing Rory is going to have an impact.
Well, if you look at it from Buffalo's point of view, first of all, Carter Bender only played in 3 games last year. So when you say you don't know who he is, I don't think anybody really knows who he is in terms of his NLL career. Anyway, I know nothing about him before that, but he scored 3 points in 3 games, and that was it. So he's kind of a yet to be seen. But one of the interesting parts of this trade is now Buffalo now has Rory Smith, they have Dane Smith, they have Billy D. Smith, and they have Hayden Smith. And if I'm not mistaken, there's another Smith that I'm forgetting. But 5 different guys named Smith on the same team who are not related. That's got to be a record.
That's funny. They want a Smith.
I know I'm the stats guy, but I don't think I have any kind of stats for that.
That is crazy. I mean, I think we've only had maybe max of 3 players with the same name. Granted, they were all related, but with the Morgans.
We had a bunch of Geiches at one point.
Oh yeah, and we did have the 3 Geiches. We could have had 4 if one didn't want to play hockey. They tried. They tried hard to get all 4 of them. Not that it did us any good whatsoever. Well, they were hoping since, they all grew up together that they'd have that natural chemistry, and either they wouldn't let them actually gel and do their thing, or they really didn't have the chemistry everybody thought they would. Either way, it didn't work.
Well, Alex is a forward, and Nanad was a defender, was he not? Ilias is kind of a transition. So
they moved him around a lot. So I will be honest when I say that I don't remember because they tested him in a lot of different positions.
So it could be that they never had any more than 1 or 2 of them on the floor at any one time, so their chemistry with each other was kind of irrelevant.
Yeah, but when they first brought him in, that's actually what Govett was telling everyone. Is like, oh, these guys have years together since they're family. They have great chemistry. It's going to be great having them all out there. And like you said, you never saw more than 2. They kept moving them positions constantly because they just couldn't seem to find where they fit with the team. And sometimes where they would put them, it just didn't make sense. I mean, Alex wasn't very aggressive, and yet they kept putting him in a role where he had to be really aggressive, and since he was so big, the guys would run into him and he'd get a penalty.
Okay, well, I think that that's all the topics that I had. If there's anything else you guys wanted to talk about, any other off-season moves or deals?
Do we know when the collective bargaining agreement's supposed to be done?
I've heard nothing about that.
Same here.
Which I think is probably not a bad thing. I know during not the last NHL lockout, but the previous one, it seemed that both sides were making press statements every day or a couple times a day, and just everybody was going on and on and on and on about it. And I know at one point I basically just thought, why don't you guys just shut up, go into a room, and get this done? Because it seemed like they were spending half their time negotiating and half their time dealing with the press. If they just ignore the press and just go get this thing done and tell us when they're done, that'd be a lot better. And I don't know if that's what's happening now. I'm kind of assuming that there's all kinds of negotiations going on. but I've heard nothing about it. So I'm kind of taking that as a good sign in that the owners and the players association are just heads down getting this done. So I guess I'm hoping anyway that no news is good news.
I hope so. It seems like a couple years it was kind of the same, that you really didn't hear anything until everything started falling through, and then it was almost too late. But and then there was that. Well, that
Okay,
was
well, I
really...
guess. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that was the only other thing I could think of, because we don't really have a schedule we can discuss yet, and it's been quiet in the off season. I expected a few more trades by now, but it might be because they're still waiting for that agreement.
Yeah, maybe Steve Dietrich is the only guy who was confident enough that the CBA won't be vastly different and cause the trades that he has made to work out worse for him somehow. Or maybe he has some insider information, but I don't know why he would and the other GMs wouldn't.
Yeah, they know each other too well to have inside information, I think.
True. Okay, well, I guess we'll wrap things up for our first broadcast of Addicted to Lacrosse. My name is Graeme Perro. My co-hosts today have been Melissa Daphne and Tyler Fitch. And I don't know when the next time we'll see you is, but it will be soon, hopefully. Maybe we'll have another show dedicated to the second half of the off season. So we'll see you later.